Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into one of the most densely populated places on Earth, where the hills fold in on each other like wrinkled blankets and houses stack up in impossible layers of concrete and tin. You can almost feel the humid Rio air clinging to your skin, the faint smell of frying street food mixing with gasoline from the motorbikes weaving through alleyways just wide enough for a handshake. We're going to Rocinha, Brazil's largest favela, a place where entire worlds exist inside a few square kilometers, and where one man's story would ripple through every narrow street and shanty. And let me warn you now, you probably won't survive this reality even for a day. The rules here aren't written in books, and breaking them can be fatal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what's the local time for you? Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins at dawn, when Rocinha stirs like a restless giant. From above, it resembles a maze with no end, a quilt of corrugated roofs and painted walls clinging to the hillsides of Rio de Janeiro's south zone. The city's famous beaches, Copacabana, Ipanema, aren't far, but life in Rocinha might as well be on another planet. Residents wake early, the sounds of roosters competing with the muffled bass of someone's stereo still going from last night. Children dart barefoot down staircases. Older women set up stalls selling fresh pain francais and sweet coffee, and motorbike taxis rev at every corner, carrying workers down to the city. It's a rhythm Antônio Francisco Bonfim Lopes, known as Nem to locals, knows by heart. But in 2011, Nem isn't just another face in the crowd. He's the man pulling invisible strings, the one everyone recognizes but rarely sees up close. And yet, he didn't start there. Before the nickname, before the shadowy power, there was just Antonio, a boy growing up in a place where opportunity often came at the barrel of a gun. Rocinha wasn't always this massive, but it has always been precarious. Built informally over decades, its narrow alleys twist like veins, each one connected to another, impossible for outsiders to fully map. This complexity offers safety for those who know it, danger for those who don't. Many people still think that Rocinha is nothing more than crime and chaos. But ask anyone who's lived there, and they'll tell you about the strong sense of community, the festas where samba spills into the streets, and the neighborhood loyalty that can be fiercer than family. So what do you think? Can a place be both a sanctuary and a battlefield? Back then, Antonio was just a boy with a soccer ball at his feet. Rocinha had a way of turning dreams into survival skills, and for many kids, soccer was a way to forget the daily stress. Antonio's love for the game wasn't unique, but his determination stood out. He'd stay out until the streetlights flickered on, his bare toes skimming the battered ball as if it were glued to him. Coaches would notice, friends would gather, and for a few precious hours, the rough terrain of the favela became a stadium in his mind. But even soccer couldn't shield him from reality. His family, like most, struggled financially. Jobs in the formal economy were scarce for residents of Rocinha, and the informal economy, everything from selling snacks to more dangerous trades, became the norm. Antonio's father worked long hours for little pay, and his mother hustled to keep food on the table. Antonio felt the weight of that hardship, even as a child. He'd see the older boys, the ones who rode flashy motorbikes and carried themselves with unearned confidence, and wonder how they had so much when his family had so little. It was this environment, vibrant yet unforgiving, that shaped him. He learned quickly who to greet, who to avoid, and how to read the subtle shifts in the streets. One wrong move could land someone in trouble, and Antonio was observant enough to notice the undercurrents. While soccer gave him joy, those quiet observations would one day make him something far more dangerous than a skilled athlete. On mornings like this, the sunlight streaming down the hills seems almost gentle, but Antonio knows better. He's watched too many families mourn in these same alleys, their grief muffled by the noise of everyday life pressing forward. He's also seen kindness, neighbors sharing food, strangers helping fix a roof. But in Rocinha, kindness doesn't always keep you safe. He walks past a group of older teens lounging on a stoop, their conversation low and purposeful. Antonio catches a word here and there, delivery, police, deadline, and keeps his head down. You don't ask questions you're not invited to. At least, not yet. By the time he reaches the dusty soccer pitch at the bottom of the hill, the day is already heating up. He drops his ball, starts juggling, and for a moment, the worries fade. This pitch has seen him through scraped knees, sprained ankles, and countless games that ended in both triumph and tears. But soon, this same love for soccer will become something else entirely. A bridge to power he doesn't even realize is waiting. As the ball arcs through the air and lands with a thud, a voice calls his name. It's one of the local organizers for the community leagues, a man Antonio respects. The man smiles and waves him over. "You're good, Garotto," he says. "You keep playing like that. Maybe someone important will notice." Antonio doesn't know it yet, but someone already has. Antonio isn't the kind of kid who chases compliments, but those words linger like the warm echo of a goal scored in extra time. He nods, flashes a shy grin, and keeps practicing until the league organizer walks away. The ball bounces off his knee, rolls across the patchy dirt, and stops at the bare feet of a boy younger than him. Antonio jogs over, scoops it up, and ruffles the boy's hair, handing it back. Small gestures like this matter in Rocinha, where children notice who sees them and who doesn't. By the time he trudges back up the hill, sweaty and tired, the sun has settled fully on Rocinha's layered rooftops, and the streets are buzzing with energy. Vendors shout prices for fresh produce. Men balance crates of soft drinks on their shoulders, and somewhere, music blares from a radio perched precariously on a windowsill. It's a symphony of survival, and Antonio's family is just one of thousands trying to find harmony in it. At home, his mother is making lunch. A simple meal of rice, beans, and a bit of stewed chicken. A treat saved for days when she could stretch the budget. She smiles when she sees Antonio, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. "Did you eat already?" she asks. Antonio shakes his head, grateful for the food, but more grateful for her steady presence. His father isn't home yet, likely working another grueling shift. Rocinha's poverty was no secret, but to a child, it could feel like a shadow you only understood in pieces. Antonio had friends who rarely went to school because they had to help their parents earn money. Friends who vanished for weeks because their families moved deeper into the hills or because something worse happened. He clung to school and soccer because they offered a sense of normalcy, but even he knew those things alone couldn't build a future. One afternoon, on his way to school, Antonio passed a group of older boys clustered near a narrow alley. Their sneakers were spotless, their shirts brand new, and their pockets jingled with coins. One of them, a lanky kid named Marcelo, called out, "Hey, Nem!" he said. The nickname was new, a playful jab at Antonio's quiet demeanor. You want to make some real money? Antonio froze. He wasn't naive. He knew what these boys were involved in. Rocinha's narrow pathways were full of whispers about deliveries, packages, and the business that kept certain people's wallets thick. Still, Marcelo's smile was disarming, almost friendly. Nothing big, Marcelo continued. Just helping out. You run fast, you'll be fine. Nem shook his head. I have school, he said, his voice softer than he intended. The boys laughed, and Marcelo shrugged. Suit yourself, he said. But school doesn't pay for sneakers like these. That small interaction stuck with Antonio. He walked away, but he kept thinking about it during class, about how Marcelo and his crew didn't look worried about rent or bills. They moved with a confidence Antonio had never felt. Many people still think that kids like Antonio could just choose to ignore temptation. But in a place where poverty dictated nearly every decision, the line between right and wrong blurred quickly. So what do you think? If you were in Antonio's shoes, would you have said no forever? For now, Antonio stayed focused on his books and his ball. His mother's quiet sacrifices weighed heavily on him, and the idea of disappointing her was worse than the hunger that sometimes gnawed at his stomach. He knew she dreamed of him becoming something more, maybe a teacher, maybe even a professional soccer player. But he also knew she couldn't protect him from everything. Weeks passed, and Marcelo kept inviting him. Sometimes it was a simple task: deliver a note, carry a package to a neighbor. It's nothing dangerous, Marcelo insisted. Antonio resisted, but curiosity and the sight of Marcelo's new watch wore him down. One evening after soccer practice, Marcelo approached again. Just this once, he said. You'll be home in 10 minutes, and I'll pay you more than your father makes in a day. Antonio hesitated, then nodded. He told himself it was just one job. He sprinted through the alleys, heart pounding, gripping the small plastic bag Marcelo had given him. He didn't look inside. He delivered it, got paid, and returned home before anyone noticed. The money was intoxicating. It wasn't much by city standards, but to Antonio, it felt like a fortune. He bought his mother a better cut of meat the next day, watching her eyes widen in surprise. He didn't tell her where the money came from, and she didn't ask. That's how it started. Small favors, small payments, each one easier than the last. Antonio wasn't officially part of any gang, but he was on their radar now. He still played soccer, still went to school, but the pull of the streets was undeniable. He began to understand the layers of Rocinha's underworld, how certain alleys belonged to certain people, how the police only showed up when it benefited them, how some neighbors lived in fear while others thrived. At night, Antonio would lie awake listening to the distant pop of fireworks, or was it gunfire, and wonder if he was already in too deep. He thought about Marcelo's promise. You'll be fine. But he also thought about the looks on his mother's and father's faces, the way they clung to hope like a lifeline. Still, it was hard to ignore the sense of control that came with money, even just a little. He could buy new cleats now, help his mother with groceries, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel entirely powerless. But power, even in its smallest form, comes at a price. Antonio's sense of control was fragile, like a thin thread stretched tight. He wanted to believe he could balance school, soccer, and the occasional errand for Marcelo's crew. But Rocinha was a place that demanded choices. One evening, as he walked home from the soccer pitch, he spotted Marcelo again, this time leaning against a motorbike that wasn't there the week before. The engine was still warm, the chrome polished to a shine. Marcelo smirked when he saw Antonio's eyes linger. "Your turn next, Nem," he said, tossing him a cold can of soda. "Do a few more runs, and you'll be riding too. No more walking those hills until your legs burn." Antonio cracked open the can, the carbonation fizzing softly in the humid air. He didn't answer right away. He knew what Marcelo meant. More runs, bigger deliveries, and a deeper step into something he wasn't sure he could step out of. But at 15, the lure of independence was magnetic. He was tired of patching the soles of his shoes, tired of watching his parents worry over bills they couldn't pay. That night, Antonio said yes to another delivery, telling himself it would be his last. He sprinted through Rocinha's tangled alleyways, his heart racing not just from the exertion, but from the thrill. The cash Marcelo handed him afterward felt heavier than usual, a weight he both craved and feared. He tucked it into his pocket and hurried home, but the choice lingered in his mind long after. The next few weeks blurred. One job became 2, then 3. Marcelo's crew started calling on him regularly because he was reliable, quick, and quiet. He kept his head down, avoided questions, and never shorted them on their money. These were the qualities older gang members valued, and though Antonio didn't know it yet, he was earning their respect. But Rocinha was unpredictable. One afternoon, while Antonio was returning from a delivery, he turned a corner and found himself face to face with a police patrol. The officers were young, jumpy, and visibly tense. One of them shouted at him to stop, but Antonio didn't think. He ran. The alleys twisted like a puzzle, his feet slapping against the concrete as the sound of boots echoed behind him. He ducked into a narrow passage only locals would know, scrambled over a low wall, and burst into a courtyard where kids were playing soccer. The officers never followed. He tried to calm his breathing, acting like he belonged there, but his heart pounded so hard, it felt like it would betray him. That night, Antonio couldn't sleep. He replayed the chase in his mind, realizing how close he'd come to being arrested, or worse. Many people still think that children caught up in the drug trade can simply walk away whenever they want. But Antonio knew better. Walking away meant you owed someone money or loyalty, and both debts could be deadly. So what do you think? Should he have stopped while he still had a chance? Or was the path already set? He didn't tell Marcelo about the close call. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he poured himself into soccer again, hoping the rhythm of the game could quiet the storm inside. When he played, everything else faded. The smell of gunpowder from the distant hills, the gossip about who got arrested, the worry about his parents. But even soccer couldn't erase the fact that Rocinha was changing. Around this time, a power vacuum opened in the favela. One of the top gang leaders had been arrested, leaving the hierarchy in disarray. Older members jostled for position, crews whispered about alliances, and the police presence grew heavier. Antonio noticed more armed men on the corners, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, their faces hard. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Marcelo seemed unconcerned. "This is just how it works," he told Antonio one night. "One guy falls, another steps up. Maybe one day that'll be me, or you." Antonio shook his head. "I don't want that," he said honestly. Marcelo laughed. "Everybody says that at first," he replied, but Antonio wasn't sure he believed him. He still dreamed of a different future, though it felt increasingly distant. He thought of his mother's smile when he handed her money for groceries, his father's tired but grateful nod. That was the future he wanted, to take care of them without risking his life every day. Yet Rocinha had a way of pulling people deeper, and Antonio was no exception. One evening, Marcelo asked him to join a soccer tournament sponsored by their crew. "It's good for the community," Marcelo said. "Keeps the kids busy, and it shows everyone we're the ones looking out for them." Antonio agreed. He loved the game too much to say no, and the tournament was a huge event. Teams from across the favela competed on a dusty field, their fans cheering from the sidelines. Local vendors sold food, and music played from portable speakers. Antonio noticed how Marcelo and the older gang members worked the crowd, handing out drinks and slapping backs. It was part celebration, part recruitment drive, and it worked. Antonio's team won their match, and he could feel the respect of the community growing around him. It wasn't just about soccer anymore. It was about belonging. He saw how the gang used the tournament to build loyalty, how they blurred the lines between criminal enterprise and community service. For a kid like Antonio, it was hard to separate the two. As the sun set and the tournament wrapped up, Marcelo clapped a hand on Antonio's shoulder. "You're one of us now, Nem," he said with a grin. Antonio didn't answer, but deep down, he knew something had shifted. By the time Antonio walked home that night, the tournament's cheers still echoed in his ears. He replayed the goals in his mind, the dusty ball rolling perfectly into the net, the crowd roaring, Marcelo shouting his nickname from the sideline. For a few hours, it had felt pure, like the old days when soccer was just a game. But beneath the celebration, Antonio had noticed the sidelong glances, the quiet conversations happening at the edges of the field. Something larger was brewing in Rocinha, and even if he didn't fully understand it, he could feel the ground shifting under his feet. The arrest of the previous boss had created a vacuum no one could ignore. Rocinha's drug trade was too lucrative to remain leaderless, and the competing factions knew it. Antonio wasn't high enough up the ladder to know the details, but he saw the signs. Men with rifles patrolled the alleyways more openly. Fresh graffiti marked territory in bold letters, signaling who claimed what. Older residents whispered about alliances forming and enemies plotting revenge. One afternoon, on his way back from school, Antonio overheard two men talking in hushed voices near a market stall. "If we don't pick someone soon," one of them muttered, "the outsiders will come in and take everything." Antonio pretended not to hear, but the words lodged in his mind. The idea of outsiders taking over Rocinha sent a chill through him. That night, his father sat silently at the dinner table, his hands calloused from work, his eyes distant. "Stay out of trouble, Antonio," he said quietly as they ate. "Things are changing. The police are everywhere, and everyone's on edge." Antonio nodded, but he didn't mention the jobs he'd been running or the tournament that Marcelo's crew had sponsored. His father had no idea how close his son already was to the epicenter of those changes. The truth was, Antonio didn't know how to pull back now. He still went to school and soccer practice, but the lines between those worlds and Marcelo's crew were blurring. Sometimes, the crew would ask him to deliver packages to men he'd just seen watching the tournament from the sidelines. Other times, they'd ask him to keep an eye on certain alleys while they handled business. One evening, Marcelo pulled Antonio aside. "The bosses are meeting soon," he said. "They're going to decide who's in charge now. Until then, keep your head down. Things could get messy." Antonio wanted to ask what that meant, but he didn't. He'd learned not to ask too many questions. Instead, he nodded and focused on his soccer ball, bouncing it lightly off his knee. Marcelo clapped him on the back. "You're smart, Nem," he said. "Stay that way." But staying smart didn't make Rocinha feel any safer. Police raids became more frequent, sometimes in the middle of the night. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights sweeping the hills like giant flashlights. Antonio's family would huddle together when the sound of gunfire echoed through the alleys, hoping the bullets wouldn't find their way into their home. During one particularly tense night, Antonio lay awake listening to the chaos outside. He heard shouts, doors slamming, and the unmistakable crack of rifles. His mother whispered a prayer under her breath, and Antonio tried to imagine he was back on the soccer field, the cheers drowning out the noise. But it didn't work. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world was closing in. Many people still think that a community like Rocinha only thrives on fear. But Antonio saw a different side too. Neighbors looked out for each other. Families shared food when someone went hungry. Kids still played soccer in the alleys, even when the air was thick with tension. So what do you think? Can a place be both a home and a battlefield at the same time? The following week, news spread that the meeting Marcelo had mentioned had finally happened. The factions had chosen a new leader, someone everyone simply called the Don. Antonio didn't know much about him yet, only that he was older, disciplined, and intent on restoring order. Marcelo seemed relieved. "Things will settle down now," he said. But the Don wasn't just taking control of the drug trade. He was reshaping Rocinha's power structure, deciding who stayed in the inner circle and who got pushed out. Antonio was far from the center of that web, but he could feel the ripples reaching him. Marcelo's crew grew bolder, patrolling more openly, and Antonio noticed how their presence made some neighbors nervous. One evening, Marcelo invited Antonio to ride with him on the motorbike through the heart of Rocinha. The wind whipped against Antonio's face as they navigated the labyrinthine streets, the lights of Rio's wealthier neighborhoods glittering in the distance. Marcelo gestured toward the city skyline. "Out there, they look down on us," he said. "They think Rocinha is just a jungle. But in here, we're the ones who decide." Antonio didn't know how to respond. He was still just a teenager, caught between the simple joys of soccer and the complex realities of the streets. But he couldn't ignore how Marcelo's words resonated. For the first time, Antonio began to wonder if his path was leading somewhere he hadn't chosen, and whether he'd have the courage to change it. The bike roared up the hill, past graffiti marking the Don's territory, and Antonio glanced at Marcelo. There was a confidence in his friend's posture, a sense of purpose Antonio didn't feel. He looked back at the distant city lights and wondered which world he truly belonged to. The soccer tournament had done more than give Antonio a place to play. It had planted him deeper in the web of influence Marcelo's crew was weaving. As weeks passed, more tournaments followed, each one larger, louder, and better funded than the last. There were new uniforms for the teams, better prizes for the winners, and even live music to keep the crowd buzzing between matches. Rocinha's families showed up in droves, grateful for a chance to gather without fear, if only for a day. Marcelo noticed the difference it made, too. "See how they cheer?" he said one afternoon as he and Antonio watched the finals from the sideline. "It's not just the game. They cheer because they feel safe. They cheer because we're giving them something the government never will." Antonio nodded, even though he wasn't sure how much he believed it. He knew these tournaments weren't just about community goodwill. They were strategic. Marcelo's crew was quietly replacing absent social programs with their own brand of order, building loyalty one soccer match at a time. and Antonio, with his talent and easy smile, was becoming an asset. One evening, Marcelo handed Antonio a stack of flyers to deliver around the favela, announcing the next tournament. "Everyone knows you," Marcelo said. "When you give them one of these, they'll listen. You've got that kind of face." Antonio wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning, but he took the flyers anyway. As he went door to door, he saw how much the tournaments meant to people. Mothers thanked him for organizing something positive for the kids. Fathers asked if there would be enough food this time. Children begged to know if they could play. But Antonio also noticed the other side of it. The crew's men watching from corners, making sure everyone knew who was in charge. They weren't overtly threatening, but their presence was a silent reminder. The tournament that followed was the biggest yet, drawing teams from outside Rocinha. On game day, the dusty pitch was packed, the crowd's energy electric. Antonio's team made it to the finals, and though they didn't win, the applause that followed their match was louder than ever. Marcelo was thrilled. "Look at this, Nem," he said. "We own this favela. The Don's gonna notice what we're building here." Antonio felt a swell of pride and unease all at once. He loved the game, loved the sense of unity the tournaments created, but he couldn't ignore how seamlessly Marcelo's crew blended crime and community. It was like they were building something stronger than fear, a sense of obligation. Later that night, after the crowd had dispersed and the music had faded, Marcelo pulled Antonio aside. "The Don's been watching you," he said. "He likes how you carry yourself. He sees you're loyal. Keep it up, and you'll be more than just a kid running errands." Antonio didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure he wanted to be more in that world, but he didn't want to disappoint Marcelo either. At home, his mother fussed over his dusty clothes, asking if he'd eaten. Antonio smiled and nodded, but he didn't tell her about the Don. He didn't tell her about the offers that were starting to trickle in. Better pay, bigger responsibilities. She still believed in the boy who loved soccer, and Antonio couldn't bear to shatter that image. Yet, the more involved he became, the harder it was to keep those two worlds separate. Marcelo started inviting him to meetings, not to talk, but to listen. He learned about the network that kept Rocinha's drug trade running, the lookouts perched on rooftops, the couriers like himself darting through alleys, the older men who negotiated shipments with suppliers. It was a hierarchy as intricate as the favela's streets, and Antonio was beginning to see how it all fit together. One night, as the group gathered around a rickety table in a dimly lit house, Marcelo leaned in and whispered, "You see now why the tournaments matter. They make us untouchable. The people will protect us because we're the ones protecting them." Antonio nodded slowly. He understood the logic, but he also saw the flaws. Protection came with strings, and those strings could tighten into a noose. Many people still think that crime syndicates only survive on intimidation, but Antonio could see how trust and gratitude could be even more powerful tools. So what do you think? Does kindness given with strings attached still count as kindness? A few days later, Rocinha was buzzing with news. The Don himself would be attending the next tournament. Marcelo was ecstatic. "This is our chance," he told Antonio. "If we impress him, we're set." Antonio felt the weight of that expectation as game day approached. He practiced harder than ever, but it wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about proving himself worthy in a world that didn't forgive failure. When the day arrived, the pitch was overflowing. Children perched on rooftops to watch, and vendors lined the streets. The Don arrived quietly, surrounded by men whose faces betrayed no emotion. He stood at the edge of the field, arms crossed, observing everything. Antonio's team played their hearts out, and when he scored the winning goal in the final minutes, the crowd erupted. He glanced at the Don, who gave a single nod before disappearing into the crowd. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Marcelo clapped Antonio on the back, grinning. "You did it, Nem," he said. "The Don saw you. That's how you get noticed in Rocinha, on and off the field." Antonio smiled, but deep down he wondered what being noticed would truly cost. The Don's quiet nod at the tournament stuck with Antonio like a brand. It was more than acknowledgement. It was an invitation into a world he'd only glimpsed from the edges. For days afterward, Marcelo's crew treated him differently, clapping him on the shoulder, calling him champion, teasing him less and listening more. Antonio wasn't sure whether to be proud or uneasy, but he knew one thing. Once the Don noticed you, you didn't fade back into the crowd. Marcelo was thrilled. "You've got options now, Nem," he said one evening as they perched on a low rooftop overlooking the favela. From there, Rocinha stretched endlessly, the neon glow of Rio's wealthy neighborhoods glittering beyond its borders. "The Don's going to take care of us. We're not just errand boys anymore. We're learning the real business." Antonio stared at the twinkling lights in the distance. He still went to school, still kicked the ball around with his friends, but the balance was tipping. Marcelo was pulling him deeper into the inner circle, introducing him to older men whose names everyone whispered but never spoke aloud. These men controlled the shipments coming in from suppliers, the distribution networks that reached far beyond Rocinha's hills. Antonio was expected to watch and learn, and though no one said it outright, he understood what that meant. Loyalty was now non-negotiable. One evening, the crew met in a cramped, dimly lit house that smelled of sweat and cigarette smoke. Maps of Rocinha were spread across the table, dotted with markers indicating routes, lookouts, and safe houses. Antonio kept quiet, soaking in every detail. He realized how sophisticated the operation was, how each alleyway, each blind corner was part of a larger web designed to outmaneuver the police and protect the product. "This isn't just about moving drugs," one of the older men said, pointing to the map. "It's about control. If you control the hills, you control the city." Antonio glanced at Marcelo, who gave him a small nod as if to say, "Pay attention." The crew's leaders were careful to keep violence at a minimum. Open gunfights brought police crackdowns, and the Don preferred order to chaos. But Antonio saw how quickly things could turn. One night, a group of rivals tried to muscle in on a lucrative corner. The crew responded swiftly, corralling the interlopers and forcing them out. Antonio wasn't involved directly, but he heard the shouts, the threats, the heavy thud of fists landing. Later, Marcelo explained that one of the rivals had been handled permanently. Antonio didn't ask for details, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. Many people still think that power in places like Rocinha is just about guns and money, but Antonio was learning it was also about subtlety, knowing when to be generous, when to be ruthless, and when to disappear altogether. So what do you think? Could you live with decisions where every choice meant someone else might not live at all? To the community, however, the crew appeared almost benevolent. They sponsored more tournaments, paid for repairs to water lines, even handed out food parcels during holidays. Antonio saw the gratitude in his neighbor's eyes, and he felt a strange mix of pride and guilt. His mother praised the improvements, saying it felt safer now that the boys were looking after things. She had no idea her son was becoming one of those boys. Marcelo kept him busy, teaching him everything from how to spot undercover police to how to negotiate with suppliers. Antonio learned quickly. He had a knack for reading people, for knowing when someone was bluffing or when they were desperate. Marcelo noticed. "You're different, Nem," he said one night as they sat on a hilltop overlooking the lights of Rocinha. "You think before you act. That's rare here." Antonio didn't know how to respond. He still dreamed of simpler days when soccer was just a game and money wasn't a constant worry. But those days felt far away now. Then came a night that would test everything he'd learned. A shipment from outside the city was delayed, and the Don's lieutenants were furious. Tension hung thick in the air as rumors spread of betrayal. Marcelo was sent to find out what happened, and Antonio went with him. They tracked the missing product to a warehouse on the outskirts of Rocinha, where they found a group of nervous young couriers. They were scared, Marcelo explained later. They thought the police were following them, so they hid the stuff. It was a stupid mistake, but at least they didn't run off with it. The Don wasn't interested in excuses. The couriers were punished harshly, a reminder to everyone that mistakes wouldn't be tolerated. Antonio watched silently, the lesson searing itself into his mind. Loyalty wasn't enough. You had to be perfect. After that, Antonio's role expanded. He wasn't just delivering packages anymore. He was managing smaller crews, overseeing deliveries, and keeping the tournaments running smoothly. Soccer remained central to their strategy. Marcelo explained it best. "It's how we show the people we care. They protect us because we give them something to believe in." Antonio began to understand how the Don's empire functioned. It wasn't built on fear alone. It was built on community. And in Rocinha, community was everything. One night, after a long day of work, Antonio walked past a group of kids kicking a battered ball under a flickering streetlight. He stopped to watch, remembering when that had been his entire world. One of the boys looked up, grinned, and called out, "Hey, Nem, wanna play?" Antonio smiled, shook his head, and kept walking. He wanted to play, but he knew he couldn't. He wasn't just another kid anymore. The memory of those kids playing under the flickering streetlight stayed with Antonio for days. It was a bittersweet reminder of what his life had been before Marcelo's crew became more than a side hustle. But there wasn't time for nostalgia. Rocinha was busier than ever. The Don had begun expanding operations, leveraging Rocinha's location as a prime hub for moving cocaine deeper into Rio and beyond. Antonio saw firsthand how it worked. Shipments arrived from suppliers in the countryside or through international connections, then slipped into Rocinha's labyrinth of alleyways. From there, the product was distributed across the city, hidden in cars, buses, and even delivery trucks with legitimate business fronts. The routes were carefully chosen, always changing to outmaneuver the police. One afternoon, Marcelo brought Antonio into a planning meeting with several older lieutenants. They crowded around a table covered in maps and diagrams, the air heavy with cigarette smoke. "Rocinha is the gateway," one man said, tapping the map with his finger. "We control this hill. We control everything that moves through it. The police can raid all they want, but they'll never know these streets like we do." Antonio listened quietly, absorbing every word. He realized how strategic the operation was, how it depended not just on muscle, but on logistics and local knowledge. Rocinha's winding alleys and hidden passages weren't just home. They were a shield. Outsiders could get lost for hours, making it nearly impossible for the authorities to dismantle the network. But that didn't mean the police stopped trying. Raids became more frequent, sometimes happening in broad daylight. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights sweeping across rooftops like watchful eyes. Antonio's family, like many others, would hide indoors when the raids began, hoping to avoid stray bullets. He'd sit with his mother and father in the small living room, the hum of the television barely masking the distant gunfire. One night, after a particularly intense raid, Antonio asked Marcelo if it was worth it. All this risk, for what? So we can keep running forever? Marcelo laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. You think the government cares about us? About Rocinha? We're invisible to them unless they need a headline. This is survival, Nem. We build our own world because no one's building it for us. The words resonated with Antonio. He had seen how Marcelo's crew, under the Don's leadership, provided things the government never did. Food for hungry families, repairs for broken water pipes, soccer tournaments for restless kids. Many people still think gangs thrive only on fear, but Antonio understood now that loyalty built through kindness could be even stronger. So what do you think? If someone gives you safety and opportunity, does it matter where the help comes from? Meanwhile, Antonio's role continued to grow. He was now overseeing shipments, managing payments, and ensuring that every crew member was where they needed to be. Marcelo trusted him with more responsibility than anyone his age, and the Don seemed to approve. One evening, after a long day of moving product, Antonio sat with Marcelo on a rooftop, overlooking the glowing lights of Rio's wealthy neighborhoods in the distance. You see that? Marcelo said, pointing. They have everything, and they'd rather pretend we don't exist. But we do. And as long as we hold Rocinha, they can't ignore us. Antonio didn't answer. He was thinking about his parents, about how hard they worked for so little. He was also thinking about the kids who looked up to him now, the same way he'd once looked up to the older boys with motorbikes and new sneakers. He wondered what kind of example he was setting, but the machine of Rocinha's drug trade didn't slow down for self-reflection. Another tournament was approaching, and this one would be bigger than ever. Marcelo explained why. The Don wants everyone united. We need to remind the community that we're the reason they can walk the streets without fear. Antonio threw himself into organizing the event. He visited teams, handed out new uniforms, and arranged for food vendors and music. He could feel how much the tournaments mattered to the community, how they brought joy and normalcy to lives overshadowed by hardship. On the day of the event, the pitch was overflowing. Families crowded the sidelines, children perched on rooftops, and the air was alive with music and laughter. Antonio's team played brilliantly, and even though they didn't win, the roar of the crowd made it feel like they had. Afterward, the Don approached Antonio directly for the first time. He was a tall man with a calm demeanor, his presence commanding without a single word. You've done well, he said quietly. People trust you. That matters more than anything. Antonio felt a rush of pride, but also a chill. He knew the Don's words weren't just praise. They were a reminder that trust came with responsibility, and responsibility came with consequences. As the crowd dispersed and night fell over Rocinha, Antonio stood alone on the pitch for a moment, the smell of grilled food and the echo of laughter lingering in the air. He kicked a stray ball into the goal and whispered to himself, "What am I becoming?" He didn't have an answer yet. The Don's words lingered with Antonio long after the tournament ended. People trust you. That matters more than anything. Trust in Rocinha was both a blessing and a burden. It gave Antonio a kind of power he'd never known before, but it also tied him to a network where one mistake could unravel everything. Marcelo was quick to capitalize on Antonio's newfound reputation. "The Don likes you," he said as they walked through the crowded alleys one humid afternoon. "That means we can do bigger things now. There's a deal coming up. You'll be part of it." Antonio stopped in his tracks. "A deal? What kind of deal?" Marcelo grinned. "The kind that makes you real money. We're handling one of the biggest shipments yet, and you're going to help coordinate it." Antonio's heart pounded. He'd seen plenty of product moved through Rocinha before, but he'd always been a step removed from the most sensitive jobs. This was different. Marcelo was asking him to be part of the backbone of the operation. He nodded, trying to mask his nerves. Over the next week, Antonio shadowed Marcelo and the older lieutenants as they prepared. The shipment was coming in from the countryside, carried by trucks that looked like they belonged to a legitimate business. Once inside Rocinha, the product would be broken down into smaller packages and distributed. Every detail was meticulously planned: which alleys to use, which lookouts would signal if police were near, which houses were safe to stash the goods. Antonio was impressed by the precision, but he also felt the weight of it. He knew that if anything went wrong, the Don wouldn't hesitate to punish those responsible. The night of the deal, Rocinha felt eerily quiet. Antonio rode with Marcelo in a car loaded with boxes, his hands sweaty against his jeans. Marcelo's voice was calm but firm. "Remember, Nem, stay alert. If you see anything off, we bail, no questions." As they entered the favela's labyrinthine streets, Antonio noticed how each corner had someone stationed, watching, ready to warn the crew of trouble. It was a well-oiled machine. They reached the stash house without incident, and Antonio helped unload the boxes, his muscles straining as he carried the weight of both the product and the risk it represented. Once the job was done, Marcelo handed him a thick envelope of cash. "You've earned it," he said. "This isn't kid stuff anymore, Nem. You're part of the Corps now." Antonio accepted the money, but felt a gnawing unease. He could see how easy it was to get trapped in this world, how one success led to another until there was no way out. Many people still think that gang life is a choice easily made or unmade, but Antonio understood it was more like quicksand. The deeper you went, the harder it was to climb free. So what do you think? Could you walk away after tasting this kind of success? The Don called a meeting after the deal, congratulating the crew on their efficiency. Antonio stood at the back of the room, trying to blend in, but the Don's eyes found him. "You handled yourself well," he said. "Keep earning the community's trust. That's how we build something lasting here." Antonio nodded, his chest tight. He knew the Don was right. Trust was everything in Rocinha, and Antonio had it in spades now. Neighbors greeted him warmly, children waved when they saw him, and parents thanked him for organizing tournaments and food drives. To them, he was a young man giving back, but Antonio knew the truth. Those good deeds were tied to the drug trade that funded them. He wrestled with the contradiction every day. He wanted to believe he was making Rocinha better, but he also saw the harm: addiction, arrests, the fear of raids that kept families awake at night. Marcelo noticed Antonio's silence one evening. "You're thinking too much," he said. "This isn't complicated. We take care of the community, and they take care of us. That's how it works." Antonio didn't argue, but he wasn't convinced. He remembered the kids playing soccer under the streetlight, their laughter ringing out despite everything. He wanted that innocence back, but it felt like a dream slipping further away. The next tournament came quickly, and Antonio threw himself into the preparations. The Don was pleased with the turnout, and for a while, it felt like Rocinha was thriving. But beneath the surface, Antonio could sense cracks forming. The police were growing bolder, raiding stash houses more frequently, seizing product before it reached its destination. Rumors swirled about informants, about rival gangs looking to exploit any weakness. One night, Marcelo pulled Antonio aside. "We need to be careful," he said. "There's talk that someone in the crew is leaking information. If the Don finds out, it's not going to end well for them." Antonio felt a chill. He'd seen how the Don dealt with betrayal, and it wasn't pretty. As he walked home that night, the envelope of cash heavy in his pocket, Antonio wondered how much longer this fragile balance could hold. He was earning respect, earning money, but at what cost? The rumor of an informant gnawed at Antonio like a splinter he couldn't remove. Marcelo's warning replayed in his mind every time he saw the Don's men watching from the shadows, their eyes scanning for the slightest sign of disloyalty. Rocinha's streets, usually loud with music and chatter, felt tense, as if the entire community was holding its breath. Marcelo tried to downplay it. "This happens," he said one afternoon as they walked through a narrow alley, stepping over stray dogs sleeping in the shade. "Someone gets scared, someone gets greedy, and they start talking to the wrong people. But the Don will handle it. He always does." Antonio nodded, but he wasn't reassured. He'd seen what handling it looked like before. There was no forgiveness for betrayal in Rocinha. At home, Antonio's parents remained blissfully unaware of the undercurrents. His mother was thrilled that he seemed to be thriving, that the neighborhood was safer and more stable than in years past. "You've grown into a good man," she said one evening as she stirred a pot of beans on the stove. "People trust you. They look up to you." Her words echoed the Don's, and Antonio felt the weight of that trust like a stone on his chest. He wanted to believe he was a force for good, that the tournaments and food drives mattered more than the drug shipments fueling them. But he couldn't ignore the shadows clinging to every corner of Rocinha. One night, Marcelo invited him to a meeting with the Don and several lieutenants. They gathered in a dimly lit room, the air thick with cigarette smoke. The Don stood at the head of the table, his voice calm but sharp. "We have a problem," he said. "Someone is feeding information to the police. We will find them, and we will deal with them." He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on each man in turn. When his eyes reached Antonio, they softened slightly, but the message was clear. Loyalty wasn't optional. After the meeting, Marcelo pulled Antonio aside. "Keep your head down," he whispered. "Don't get involved in the investigation. Just do your job." But that was easier said than done. Antonio's role in the crew was growing, and he was expected to oversee more of the daily operations. He couldn't help but notice who was nervous, who avoided eye contact, who suddenly had excuses to be somewhere else. He began to suspect one of the younger couriers, a boy named Pedro who had been caught in a police sweep weeks earlier and released without explanation. Antonio mentioned his suspicions to Marcelo, who frowned. "Don't spread rumors," he said. "If Pedro's the rat, the Don will figure it out. If he's not, you don't want his blood on your hands." The next few days were tense. Police raids continued, each one more aggressive than the last. Helicopters hovered over Rocinha at night, their searchlights slicing through the darkness. The crew tightened security, changing meeting spots and shipment routes constantly. One evening, as Antonio returned from a late delivery, he saw Pedro slipping through an alley with a nervous look on his face. Antonio followed at a distance, his heart pounding. Pedro ducked into a small house on the edge of the favela, and a few minutes later, a police car pulled up quietly. Antonio didn't wait to see more. He turned and sprinted back to Marcelo, breathless as he explained what he'd seen. Marcelo's jaw tightened. "We'll take it to the Don," he said. The next day, Pedro was gone. No one spoke about it openly, but everyone knew. The raids slowed, and the tension in Rocinha eased slightly, but the message was clear. Betrayal had consequences. Antonio lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling of his room. He wasn't sure how he felt, relieved that the danger had passed or sickened by what had happened to Pedro. Many people still think that these decisions are simple, black and white, but Antonio understood the gray areas all too well. So what do you think? Could you condemn someone if it meant protecting everyone else? The next tournament was subdued compared to the others. The community came out, but the laughter felt forced, the cheers less enthusiastic. Antonio tried to lose himself in the game, but his mind kept drifting back to Pedro. After the event, Marcelo found him sitting alone on the edge of the pitch. "Don't dwell on it," Marcelo said. "This is the life we chose. If you're going to survive here, you can't second-guess every decision." Antonio didn't reply. He knew Marcelo was right, but he also knew that every decision left a mark. He wondered how many marks a person could carry before they stopped recognizing themselves. Antonio found it harder to smile after Pedro's disappearance. He still played soccer with the kids, still oversaw shipments and tournaments, still made his mother believe that he was building a respectable life. But at night, when the favela quieted and the only sound was the distant hum of motorbikes, the image of Pedro slipping into that house wouldn't leave him. Marcelo noticed the change. "You're too quiet, Nim," he said one afternoon as they sat on a low wall overlooking the crowded market. "You're starting to look like the Don, always thinking. That's good, but don't let it eat you alive." Antonio shrugged. "I'm fine." But he wasn't. He was starting to see Rocinha differently. Every friendly greeting on the street, every smile from a neighbor, felt layered with expectation. People trusted him because he was the bridge to the Don, the one who could get a problem fixed or a favor granted. But he knew that same trust could turn to fear in an instant if he failed them. The Don understood this balance better than anyone. He had built a system where loyalty was rewarded generously and disloyalty was unthinkable. Antonio saw it in action one evening when the Don summoned him and Marcelo to a meeting. They gathered in a small, sparsely furnished room lit by a single bulb. The Don stood at the center, flanked by his most trusted lieutenants. "Rocinha needs stability," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "People must believe in us, or the whole thing falls apart. That means we take care of them, but it also means we deal with problems before they grow." Antonio listened carefully. He realized the Don wasn't talking about Pedro anymore. He was talking about the police, about rival gangs, about anyone who might challenge their control. After the meeting, Marcelo clapped Antonio on the back. "You hear that? That's why the Don wins. He's not just running the drug trade, he's running the community." Antonio nodded, though he wasn't sure how he felt about that. Many people still think leaders in places like Rocinha rule only through violence, but Antonio saw how much of the Don's power came from the illusion of choice. People believed they were safer with him in charge, and in many ways, they were. So what do you think? Can true safety ever come from someone who profits from fear? In the weeks that followed, Antonio's responsibilities grew again. Marcelo trusted him to manage more of the community outreach, distributing food during holidays, paying for school supplies for local kids, even covering hospital bills for families in need. Antonio enjoyed this work, but he knew why it mattered. Every bag of rice we give out, Marcelo explained, is one less reason for the community to turn on us. At home, his mother praised him for his generosity, completely unaware of where the money came from. She invited neighbors over for dinner, bragging about how her son was helping Rocinha. Antonio smiled and let her believe it. He didn't have the heart to shatter her image of him, but even as the Don's grip on Rocinha seemed unshakable, cracks were forming. Police raids were becoming more sophisticated, often targeting stash houses the crew thought were secure. Marcelo began suspecting that the police had informants higher up than before. "Someone's giving them real intel," he said, pacing the floor of their makeshift office. "If we don't find out who, we're finished." Antonio tried to stay focused on his tasks, but the tension was palpable. The Don's lieutenants were growing paranoid, and trust was fraying. Every late delivery, every missed signal, was treated like a potential betrayal. One night, as Antonio was returning from overseeing a delivery, a group of armed police stopped him in the alley. He froze, his heart pounding. One officer stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You're Lopes, right?" the officer said. "We know who you are. You're smart, smarter than the rest of them. You don't want to end up like Pedro. Help us, and we can make things easier for you." Antonio's mouth went dry. He didn't answer. He couldn't. After a long pause, the officer shrugged. "Think about it," he said before stepping aside. Antonio walked home in a daze, his mind spinning. He knew the crew would kill him if they thought he was even considering cooperating with the police. But the encounter made him realize how precarious his position had become. That night, Marcelo noticed his unease. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing," Antonio lied. But it wasn't nothing. For the first time, Antonio understood just how dangerous trust could be. Antonio lay awake for hours after the police encounter, the officer's words looping endlessly in his head. "You're smarter than the rest of them. Help us, and we can make things easier for you." It wasn't an offer he was seriously considering, but the very thought of it was dangerous. In Rocinha, even the hint of disloyalty could be fatal. When the sun rose, Antonio forced himself back into routine. He joined Marcelo at the crew's headquarters, a nondescript house tucked deep into the favela's maze of alleys. Marcelo was already in motion, barking instructions to runners and couriers, his face tight with worry. "Another stash house was hit last night," he told Antonio. "We lost product and cash. The Don is furious." Antonio felt a familiar chill. "Do we know how the police found it?" Marcelo shook his head. "We're trying to figure it out, but someone is leaking again, and if we don't stop it, we're done." The crew's paranoia was reaching a breaking point. Lieutenants interrogated their own men, looking for signs of betrayal. Armed lookouts were posted at every entrance to Rocinha, scrutinizing everyone who came or went. Antonio watched it all unfold, knowing how dangerous this kind of fear could be. The Don called a meeting that evening. He stood in the center of the room, his voice low and steady, a sharp contrast to the tension around him. "The police are pushing harder than ever," he said. "They think they can break us. We will show them they are wrong. But first, we must clean house." Antonio felt the air thicken. He knew what clean house meant. After the meeting, Marcelo pulled him aside. "The Don wants us to watch everyone. Friends, family, even kids. Nobody is above suspicion. You understand?" Antonio nodded, though the idea of spying on neighbors made his stomach turn. Many people still think that loyalty in criminal organizations is simple, that you either have it or you don't. But Antonio understood how complicated it was. Loyalty could be coerced, bought, or broken, and the lines were never clear. So what do you think? Can loyalty truly exist when everyone is living in fear? Despite the pressure, Antonio continued to focus on the community projects that had earned him the Don's trust. He organized another food drive, making sure families had enough for the upcoming holidays. He knew these gestures were strategic, but they still mattered to the people. Mothers hugged him in gratitude. Children followed him down the street, asking when the next soccer tournament would be. At home, his mother was glowing with pride. "You're doing good work, Antonio," she said as they decorated their small house with paper lanterns. "Your father and I couldn't be prouder." Antonio smiled weakly, wishing her words could erase the weight he was carrying. He thought of Pedro, of the police officer's offer, of the Don's chilling command to clean house. Then came another raid. This one was larger and more coordinated than any before. Police stormed Rocinha in the middle of the night, arresting dozens of suspected crew members and seizing large amounts of cash and product. The streets were chaos, sirens, shouting, the thump of helicopter blades overhead. Antonio's family huddled together in fear, praying the police wouldn't break down their door. By morning, the favela was in shock. Several key lieutenants had been taken, and rumors swirled that the Don himself had narrowly escaped. Marcelo arrived at Antonio's house looking exhausted and furious. "We can't keep taking hits like this," he said. "The Don is planning something big. He wants to remind the police who they're dealing with." Antonio didn't like the sound of that. "What does he mean?" Marcelo's jaw tightened. "You'll see. Just be ready." The following days were tense. The Don ordered the crew to go underground, limiting movement and communication. Meetings were held in secret, and Antonio was careful not to attract attention. But he could feel the pressure mounting. One night, as he walked home from a meeting, he noticed a police car parked at the edge of the favela. The same officer from before was leaning against it, smoking a cigarette. When he saw Antonio, he gave a small nod. "Think about what I said," the officer called softly. "You don't have to go down with them." Antonio didn't respond. He just kept walking, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He knew he had to stay focused. The Don was preparing for a counterstrike, and Antonio had no idea what that would look like. But he was certain of one thing. Rocinha was heading toward a storm, and no one would escape unscathed. The storm arrived sooner than Antonio expected. Within a week of the last raid, Rocinha was on lockdown, the Don's men patrolling every alley with rifles slung across their chests. The community, once vibrant with the sounds of music and chatter, was eerily quiet. Even the children seemed to sense that something was brewing. Marcelo briefed Antonio in hushed tones one night as they huddled in a safe house deep in the hills. "The Don's consolidating," he said. "We can't afford to look weak. Every rival gang in Rio is watching us right now, and the police think they've got us on the ropes. We're going to show them we're still in control." Antonio frowned. "How?" "Another tournament isn't going to fix this." Marcelo gave him a sharp look. "This isn't about soccer anymore, Nem. This is about survival. We're taking over the corners left exposed after the raids, and we're doing it quietly, without sparking a war." The plan was deceptively simple: absorb smaller crews, strengthen alliances, and secure Rocinha's drug routes before anyone else could. Antonio's job was to coordinate the logistics, moving product, shifting stash houses, and making sure new recruits were properly vetted. He threw himself into the work, though a gnawing unease stayed with him. He couldn't forget the Don's words. Clean house. The crew's expansion was swift. Within weeks, the Don had quietly eliminated potential rivals and solidified control over the favela. But it came at a cost. Antonio heard whispers about disappearances, about men who had been loyal for years, suddenly vanishing overnight. Marcelo wouldn't confirm anything, but Antonio knew better than to ask questions. Many people still think that organized crime thrives only on brute force, but Antonio could see how much of it depended on psychology, on making people believe resistance was futile. So, what do you think? If fear keeps order, is it truly order at all? As the Don tightened his grip, Antonio's public role became even more important. He resumed organizing soccer tournaments and community events, projecting an image of stability. These efforts worked. Families who had been on edge after the raids began to relax, grateful for the sense of normalcy. Antonio could feel the community's trust returning, and it was both comforting and unsettling. One evening, after a long day of preparations, Antonio walked home through a maze of alleyways, the smell of grilled meat wafting from nearby food stands. He passed a group of kids kicking a ball against a cracked wall, their laughter echoing through the narrow street. One of them looked up and waved. "Nem, when's the next tournament?" "Soon," Antonio said with a smile, though inside he felt hollow. At home, his mother fussed over him as always, asking about his day. She had no idea of the weight he carried, of the decisions he was forced to make every hour. She believed her son was helping Rocinha, and Antonio let her believe it. But the pressure was building again. The police had not given up, and the Don's network was under constant surveillance. One night, Marcelo arrived with news that made Antonio's blood run cold. "They're planning another major raid," Marcelo said. "We have to move everything. Cash, product, people now." Antonio worked through the night, coordinating the evacuation of stash houses and rerouting deliveries. The crew moved with clockwork precision, using decoys and hidden passageways to stay ahead of the authorities. But as dawn broke, the police struck. The raid was more aggressive than anything Antonio had seen before. Helicopters hovered overhead, their searchlights sweeping across rooftops, while armored vehicles rolled into Rocinha's narrow streets. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hills as residents scrambled for safety. Antonio and Marcelo barely escaped a sweep of officers by ducking into a hidden tunnel that led out of the favela. When they finally emerged, hearts pounding, Marcelo looked at Antonio and shook his head. "This is getting worse, Nem. They're not going to stop until they have the Don in chains, or dead." Antonio didn't respond. He was thinking about his family, about the children who looked up to him, about the fragile peace they'd worked so hard to maintain. He knew Marcelo was right. The Don's empire was a target, and it was only a matter of time before the net closed completely. That night, Antonio stood alone on a rooftop overlooking Rocinha, the city lights glittering in the distance. He wondered how much longer he could walk this tightrope, balancing loyalty to the crew with the quiet desire to protect the people he loved. The raid left Rocinha shaken. Burned-out vehicles and shattered windows were stark reminders of the chaos that had descended on the community. Residents emerged cautiously from their homes the following day, sweeping debris from their doorsteps and whispering about who had been arrested and who hadn't. Antonio moved quietly among them, offering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed. Marcelo was relentless. "We can't show weakness now," he told Antonio as they met with a small group of lieutenants in a candlelit safe house. "The Don wants the community calm and the crew organized. You're the one they trust, Nem. You need to be visible. Play soccer with the kids, help with repairs. Make sure everyone sees you taking care of them. Antonio understood the strategy, but it felt like a mask he couldn't remove. He would smile at mothers and pat children on the head, all the while thinking about the missing crew members whose names no one dared mention. His mother believed he was a hero in Rocinha, someone bringing hope to a place that desperately needed it. He let her believe, though the guilt gnawed at him. To the outside world, Antonio tried to project normalcy. He returned to soccer whenever he could, organizing games on the battered pitch where he'd once dreamed of becoming a professional player. The kids idolized him, and he couldn't help but feel a bittersweet pride when they called out his name. One boy tugged at his sleeve after a game. "Nem, will we ever get a real stadium here?" Antonio smiled faintly. "One day," he said, though he knew the promise was hollow. Meanwhile, the Don's grip tightened further. Marcelo explained that the police weren't the only threat. Rival gangs were watching Rocinha closely, waiting for any sign of weakness. "They think we're vulnerable after the raids," Marcelo said. "We have to remind them that we're not." This reminder came in the form of silent takeovers. Smaller crews operating on the fringes of Rocinha's territory were either absorbed into the Don's network or pushed out entirely. Antonio was tasked with smoothing these transitions, using his reputation to persuade reluctant leaders to fall in line. Most complied, preferring alliance to annihilation, but not everyone could be persuaded. One crew resisted, refusing to give up their corner. The Don ordered a quiet operation to deal with them, and Antonio was expected to help. He didn't carry a weapon. Marcelo made sure of that. But he was present when the lieutenants confronted the holdouts. The exchange was tense, voices low and hard, until one of the rivals made a move. Shots rang out in the darkness, and when it was over, the corner belonged to the Don. Antonio stood frozen, his ears ringing. Marcelo placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is the life we're in, Nem. You can't hesitate." Antonio nodded, though his stomach churned. Many people still think that acts like these are purely about greed or ambition, but Antonio understood they were also about survival. "So what do you think? If you were faced with the same choice, would you protect your world at any cost?" The following day, Antonio put on his public face again, organizing another food distribution for the community. Families lined up patiently as he handed out bags of rice and beans, smiling and exchanging pleasantries. "Thank you, Nem," one woman said softly. "Without you, we'd have nothing." Her gratitude made Antonio's chest ache. He wanted to believe he was doing good, that these gestures outweighed the darker parts of his work. But he couldn't ignore the truth. The food came from the same drug money that fueled violence and addiction. That night, Marcelo found him sitting alone on the pitch, staring at the goalposts barely visible in the moonlight. "You did well," Marcelo said, sitting beside him. "The Don sees how you handle things. He's proud of you." Antonio let out a hollow laugh. "Proud of what? That I can smile at people while we destroy their future?" Marcelo sighed. "You're thinking too much again. Look, Rocinha is better now than it was before the Dawn. Less random violence, more order. The people have food and jobs. You can't save everyone, Nem, but you can keep things from getting worse." Antonio didn't reply. He knew Marcelo believed what he was saying, and part of him wanted to believe it too. But deep down, he felt the walls closing in. The Don's world was becoming his own, and there was no easy way out. In the days following the silent takeover, Antonio began to feel the weight of Rocinha's whispers more than ever. His name was on everyone's lips, spoken with respect, gratitude, and sometimes fear. He was no longer just the kid who had been good at soccer. He was now seen as a key figure in the Don's empire. The realization made him uneasy. Marcelo didn't share his discomfort. "This is what we've worked for," he told Antonio as they stood on a hill overlooking the favela, the sea of twinkling light stretching below them. "We've built something real here. The people trust us. They trust you. That's why the Don notices you. That's why you'll go far." Antonio didn't answer. He was thinking about the rival crew they had eliminated, about the lives that had been lost to secure the Don's control. He wondered if the community's trust was genuine, or if it was simply the result of fear masked as gratitude. The Don summoned him the next evening. The meeting was held in a modest house tucked deep into Rocinha's hills, far from prying eyes. The Don sat at a small table, sipping coffee, his demeanor as calm and unreadable as always. "You've done well," he said when Antonio entered. "Marcelo speaks highly of you. The community trusts you, and that's not something you can buy. That's a gift." Antonio nodded, unsure what to say. "I need people like you," the Don continued. "People who understand that our work is bigger than the money. We bring order to Rocinha. Without us, there would be chaos, and the people would suffer." Antonio knew the Don believed what he was saying. He could see it in his eyes. But he also knew the cost of that order. He had witnessed it firsthand. The Don leaned forward. "Do you understand what I'm saying, Antonio? You have a future here if you want it, but you must be loyal. That's the only way this works." Antonio felt a chill run through him. "I understand," he said softly. As he left the meeting, Marcelo was waiting outside. "What did he say?" "He wants loyalty," Antonio replied. Marcelo smirked. "That's the Don's way. Don't worry, Nem. You've already proven yourself. Just keep doing what you're doing." But Antonio wasn't so sure. He felt the invisible chains of loyalty tightening around him, binding him to a world he wasn't sure he wanted. Many people still think that loyalty is a virtue no matter the circumstance, but Antonio knew it could also be a trap. So what do you think? When loyalty means compromising your soul, is it still worth it? Meanwhile, Rocinha was changing again. The Don's consolidation of power had brought a fragile peace to the favela, and for the first time in months, people walked the streets without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Soccer tournaments resumed, music returned to the alleyways, and families celebrated small moments of joy. Antonio tried to find comfort in these scenes. He threw himself into organizing the tournaments, making sure they were bigger and better than ever. The kids loved it, and their laughter reminded him of a simpler time. But even as he watched them play, he couldn't ignore the men with rifles standing discreetly at the edges of the field, a reminder of the reality beneath the surface. One evening, after a particularly successful tournament, Antonio returned home to find his mother waiting with a plate of food. She smiled warmly as she handed it to him. "You're doing good things for Rocinha," she said. "People are talking about how much better things are now. You should be proud." Antonio forced a smile, but her words cut deep. He wanted to be proud, but he couldn't forget the darker side of the Don's world. Later that night, Marcelo joined him on the rooftop. "The Don's happy," Marcelo said. "But the police aren't done. They're regrouping, and when they come back, it'll be harder than before. We have to be ready." Antonio looked out at the city lights, the distant hum of Rio's traffic reaching them faintly through the hills. "How much longer can we keep this up?" he asked quietly. Marcelo's expression hardened. "As long as it takes. We're not just fighting for ourselves, Nem. We're fighting for Rocinha. Don't forget that. Antonio didn't respond. He was thinking about the people who relied on him, about the kids who believed in him, and about the Don's unwavering demand for loyalty. He wondered how long he could keep walking this line before it broke beneath his feet. Antonio could feel the balance of his world growing more fragile by the day. Rocinha's streets were quieter, yes, but it was the kind of quiet that hummed with tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. The Don's empire was functioning smoothly on the surface, but Antonio had seen enough to know that peace in the favela was always temporary. Marcelo called him one evening with news that made Antonio's stomach knot. "There's been a betrayal," he said, his voice clipped. "One of the lieutenants has been talking to the police. The Don wants us to handle it tonight." Antonio hesitated. "Handle it how?" Marcelo gave him a look that said the question didn't need answering. "You don't need to do anything but be there," he said. "But the Don wants you to see how this works. It's part of earning his trust." Antonio's chest tightened. He'd seen the aftermath of betrayals before, but being present for one was different. Still, he followed Marcelo to a secluded house at the edge of Rocinha, where several of the Don's men were waiting. The accused lieutenant, a man Antonio had shared meals with, stood in the center of the room, flanked by 2 armed guards. The Don arrived moments later, his expression calm, his voice measured as he spoke. "You had a choice," he said to the man. "You chose to betray the family. Do you understand the consequences?" The man's protests were desperate but futile. The Don didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger. He simply gave a small nod, and the room erupted in finality. Antonio turned his head as the sound of gunfire filled the air, but he couldn't block out the weight of what had just happened. Afterward, Marcelo guided him out of the house. "This is the reality, Nem," he said quietly. "Betrayal can't be tolerated. If we start forgiving people who turn on us, the whole thing falls apart." Antonio nodded numbly, though his mind was spinning. He understood the logic, but he also knew something in him had shifted. Many people still think that acts like these are about vengeance, but Antonio saw they were about control. "So what do you think? Could you stay loyal to a world where loyalty was enforced through fear?" In the days that followed, Antonio threw himself into work, trying to bury the memory. He organized another soccer tournament, using the energy of the community to mask his own unease. The tournament was a success, drawing record crowds, and Antonio's public image soared. Mothers thanked him for bringing joy back to Rocinha. Children followed him through the streets, calling his name. But behind the smiles, Antonio was troubled. He couldn't stop thinking about the lieutenant, about how easily the Don had erased him from existence. He wondered if his own loyalty would ever be questioned, and what would happen if it was. That night, Marcelo joined him on the rooftop, as he often did when Antonio was lost in thought. "You're too hard on yourself," Marcelo said. "You think the Don doesn't see the good you're doing? The people trust you. That's what keeps Rocinha strong," Antonio sighed. "What if I don't trust myself anymore?" Marcelo frowned. "Then you keep going until you do. This life isn't about how you feel, Nem. It's about what needs to be done." Antonio didn't answer. He watched the distant lights of Rio shimmer against the horizon, wondering how many more lines he would have to cross before he couldn't come back. That night, Rocinha seemed quieter than usual. The air was heavy, as though the hills themselves were holding their breath. Antonio lay awake, listening to the faint sound of music drifting up from a nearby alley. He thought of the kids who played soccer in the streets, of his mother's unwavering faith in him, and of the Don's voice, calm and final, as he delivered judgment. He knew the storm was far from over. Antonio's unease didn't fade in the days after the execution. It deepened. Rocinha was calmer on the surface, but Antonio knew it was the brittle kind of calm that could shatter with the smallest spark. He carried the memory of the Don's unflinching nod everywhere he went, and it haunted him in ways he couldn't explain. Marcelo noticed the change. "You've got that faraway look again," he said one afternoon as they walked through the favela. "Don't let it mess with your head, Nem. We're keeping Rocinha safe. You saw what happens when people betray us. We can't afford that." Antonio didn't argue. He knew Marcelo was right, at least from the Don's perspective. But the logic of survival didn't erase the image of the man pleading for his life. He tried to throw himself into community work, using tournaments and food drives to restore a sense of normalcy. The kids smiled, the mothers thanked him, and the lieutenants praised his efforts. Yet every compliment felt like another link in a chain he wasn't sure he wanted to wear. One evening, Antonio was walking home after overseeing a delivery when a reporter from a major Rio newspaper approached him. She was young, sharp-eyed, and persistent. "You're Lopes, right?" she asked. "People say you're the reason Rocinha is so organized now. I'd like to interview you." Antonio stiffened. "I don't do interviews," he said. The reporter didn't back down. "I'm not here to hurt you. I want to tell the story of how Rocinha has changed. Families feel safer. Kids have opportunities. Isn't that something you want people to know?" Antonio's instincts told him to walk away, but something in her tone disarmed him. He gave her a guarded nod. "I'll think about it," he said, before disappearing into the maze of alleys. Later, Marcelo was furious when Antonio told him. "What were you thinking, even talking to her?" he demanded. "The Don will lose it if he hears about this. We don't need the press digging around here." "I didn't agree to anything," Antonio replied. "She just asked." Marcelo shook his head. "Stay away from her. She's trouble." But Antonio couldn't stop thinking about the reporter. She was the first outsider in a long time who had spoken to him like he was more than a cog in the Don's machine. Meanwhile, the police pressure intensified again. Raids became more frequent, and the officers seemed better informed than ever. Marcelo suspected another leak, but no one knew from where. The Don ordered even stricter security measures, and Antonio found himself spending nights in safe houses, away from his family, to avoid being caught in a sweep. One night, after narrowly avoiding a police raid, Antonio stood on a rooftop with Marcelo, looking down at the glowing city below. "How long can we keep this up?" he asked quietly. Marcelo sighed. "As long as we have to." "You think the Don is just going to give up? He built all of this. He's not letting it go without a fight." Antonio didn't reply. He was thinking about the kids who would grow up idolizing the Don, the way he once idolized the older boys with motorbikes and new sneakers. He wondered what chance they would have at a different life. The next tournament was bittersweet. The community showed up in droves, grateful for the brief escape, but Antonio could sense their underlying fear. He tried to push through it, smiling for the kids, handing out food, organizing games. The Don attended too, standing quietly at the edge of the field, his presence a reminder of who truly held power. After the tournament, the Don called Antonio aside. "You're doing good work," he said. "People believe in you. That's what makes us strong. But never forget, Antonio, strength isn't just about smiles and soccer balls. Sometimes it's about making hard choices." Antonio nodded, though the words felt heavy. Many people still think that hard choices are always noble, but Antonio knew they could also hollow a person out. So what do you think? How many pieces of yourself would you give away for the greater good? That night, as he walked home, Antonio saw the reporter again. She was waiting at the edge of the favela, notebook in hand. "I just want to talk," she said softly. Antonio hesitated. He knew it was dangerous, but he also knew he needed someone outside Rocinha to see him. Not Nem, not the Don's protege, but Antonio. Antonio stepped into the shadows with the reporter, his heart thudding in his chest. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "This place, it's not safe for you." The reporter, her name was Mariana, didn't flinch. "I've been in worse places," she said, lowering her notebook. "I'm not here to expose anyone. I just want to understand how Rocinha has changed. People talk about you, Antonio. They say you're the reason families feel safer now. Is that true?" Antonio hesitated. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. "It's complicated," he finally said. "Rocinha is different now. But it's not because of me." Mariana tilted her head. "Then who is it because of?" Antonio shook his head. "I can't talk about that." "And you shouldn't be asking." Mariana studied him for a moment, then closed her notebook. "You don't have to give me names. Just tell me what it's like for you. What it's like to live here every day." Antonio wanted to walk away, but something in her voice stopped him. He found himself talking, carefully, without details, about the challenges Rocinha faced, about the kids who had nothing but soccer to keep them off the streets, about the families who worked harder than anyone yet struggled to survive. "I just want things to be better," Antonio said softly, "but I'm not sure I know how anymore." Mariana listened without judgment, her pen still. "That's all I needed to hear," she said. "You're not the monster people make you out to be. You're human. That matters." Antonio felt a strange sense of relief as he left her. But he also knew he had crossed a line. If the Don found out he had spoken to a reporter, even innocently, it could be disastrous. Marcelo noticed Antonio's unease later that night. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," Antonio lied, but it wasn't nothing. Police pressure was escalating, and the Don's paranoia was growing. He had begun holding meetings late into the night, strategizing how to keep control. One evening, he summoned Antonio directly. "You're important to Rocinha," the Don said, his voice low and deliberate. "The people trust you. That's why I need you to be vigilant. There are enemies everywhere, inside and out. If you see anything, anyone, that seems off, you tell me." Antonio nodded, though his thoughts flickered to Mariana. The following days were tense. Raids continued, disrupting deliveries and forcing the crew to move constantly. Antonio spent long hours coordinating shipments, keeping the tournaments running, and maintaining the community's trust. But his mind kept drifting back to Mariana's words. "You're human. That matters." One night, as he left a meeting, he found Mariana waiting for him again at the edge of the favela. "You shouldn't be here," he said sharply, scanning the alley for anyone watching. "I wanted to show you something," she said, holding up a folded newspaper. The front page featured a story about Rocinha. Not about the Don, but about the children who were thriving thanks to community programs. "I wrote this," Mariana said. "No names, no details that would hurt anyone. I just wanted people to see the good happening here." Antonio scanned the article quickly. It was balanced, almost hopeful. He felt a flicker of gratitude and dread. "This could still get me killed," he muttered. Mariana met his gaze. "Or it could make the world see Rocinha differently. Maybe that's worth something." Antonio didn't know what to say. He folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket. "Go," he said. "Don't come back here again. It's not safe for either of us." Mariana nodded reluctantly and disappeared into the night. When Antonio returned to the safe house, Marcelo was waiting. "Where were you?" he asked. "Just checking on a family," Antonio replied quickly. Marcelo studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Be careful, Nem. Things are getting worse. The Don is talking about making an example of someone to send a message. You don't want to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Antonio swallowed hard. He knew Marcelo was right, but he also knew that Mariana's article had changed something inside him. Many people still think that one act of kindness or truth can't shift the course of a life, but Antonio wasn't so sure. "So what do you think? Would you risk everything for a chance to be seen as human?" That night, Antonio lay awake, the folded newspaper beside him. He had no idea how close he was to the breaking point. The article Mariana had written spread quietly through Rocinha. People who rarely read newspapers passed it around like a treasured keepsake. It showed children playing soccer on the dusty pitch Antonio had once called home, smiling families holding food parcels, and teenagers attending community classes in spaces funded by the Don's network. No names were mentioned, no incriminating details, just an image of hope amid hardship. Antonio could feel the difference. Neighbors stopped him in the alleys to thank him, their gratitude sincere. "You're making a difference, Nem," one mother said, clutching her young daughter's hand. "People outside Rocinha are finally seeing we're not just crime and violence. We're people too." Her words warmed Antonio, but they also terrified him. If the Don connected the article to him, he would view it as a risk, a potential crack in the wall of secrecy that kept his empire safe. Antonio carried that fear silently, going about his duties with the same precision as always. Marcelo, however, seemed more on edge than usual. "The Don is asking questions," he told Antonio one night as they sat in a hidden safe house. "He doesn't like attention from the outside. He's worried someone's talking to reporters or the police. And, Nem, if he thinks it's you..." Antonio's chest tightened. "I haven't told anyone anything," he said firmly. Marcelo studied him. "I believe you. But the Don doesn't run on belief. He runs on proof. Just keep your head down, okay?" The pressure only intensified. The Don was consolidating control more aggressively than ever, expanding his influence beyond Rocinha. Antonio was pulled deeper into operations, overseeing not just tournaments and community programs, but also negotiations with suppliers and crew leaders from other favelas. He was good at it. Too good. Marcelo often said Antonio had a way with people, a charisma that made them trust him, but Antonio knew that same charisma made him a target. The more people trusted him, the more dangerous he became to the Don if that trust ever shifted. Meanwhile, police raids became even more sophisticated. One early morning, Antonio was jolted awake by the sound of helicopters circling overhead. He sprinted through the alleys with Marcelo, narrowly avoiding officers who had blocked off key exits. They hid in an abandoned house for hours, listening to boots thud past the thin walls. When they finally emerged, Rocinha was in disarray. Several stash houses had been raided, and more of the Don's lieutenants had been arrested. Residents whispered nervously in the streets, wondering if the Don's control was slipping. The Don moved quickly to counter that perception. He ordered another massive community project, repairs to a vital water system that had been neglected by the government for years. Antonio was put in charge, and he threw himself into the work. For weeks, he oversaw crews who rebuilt pipes and tanks, ensuring every household had reliable water. When the system was finally restored, the community erupted in gratitude. "This is why we stand by you," one elder told Antonio, clasping his hands. You care about us. The police, the politicians, they don't care. But you do. Antonio smiled weakly, though the praise only deepened his inner conflict. Many people still think that gestures like these erase the harm of the drug trade, but Antonio knew it wasn't that simple. So, what do you think? Can good deeds truly outweigh the darker realities that make them possible? The Don attended the water system's reopening ceremony, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. He watched Antonio closely as the community cheered, and when the crowd dispersed, he called him aside. You've done well, the Don said. The people love you. That's useful. But you need to be careful, Antonio. Love can turn to suspicion very quickly if the wrong story gets out. Antonio felt a chill. I understand, he said softly. The Don's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you? Because I hear whispers about reporters sniffing around Rocinha. If I find out someone in my circle is talking to them, I won't be as forgiving as I was last time. Antonio nodded, forcing himself to meet the Don's gaze. I haven't talked to anyone, he said. The Don's stare lingered a moment longer before he nodded and walked away. That night, Antonio found Mariana's newspaper article again, folded neatly in his jacket pocket. He knew keeping it was dangerous, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It was the only tangible reminder that someone outside Rocinha had seen the good in him. But in Rocinha, reminders like that could get a person killed. The Don's warning echoed in Antonio's mind for days. Love can turn to suspicion very quickly if the wrong story gets out. He carried the words with him like a heavy stone, and every time he caught someone's gaze lingering on him too long, he wondered if they knew about Mariana. Marcelo tried to steady him. You're overthinking again, he said as they walked through Rocinha's winding alleys one humid afternoon. The Don trusts you. He wouldn't have put you in charge of the water project otherwise. Just keep doing what you're doing. But Antonio couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He kept his interactions with Mariana buried deep, even from Marcelo, though it meant carrying the secret alone. He told himself he would never see her again, that it was the only way to stay safe. Meanwhile, Rocinha was evolving. The Don's network had expanded its reach well beyond the favela, connecting with larger cartels and suppliers from across Brazil. Antonio was now attending high-level meetings where millions of reais were discussed casually, where men with international ties outlined strategies for distribution. He understood that he was no longer just a community liaison. He was becoming a key figure in the Don's empire. It wasn't just the business that was changing. The Don himself seemed more distant, more calculating. He rarely smiled, and when he spoke, his words carried a sharper edge. Antonio suspected the mounting police pressure was wearing on him. One evening, the Don called Antonio and Marcelo to a private meeting. The authorities are coordinating with federal forces now, he said, his voice calm but hard. They're not just trying to take down Rocinha. They want to dismantle the entire network. We can't allow that. We need to remind them who we are. Marcelo's eyes lit with a familiar resolve, but Antonio felt his stomach turn. What do you mean by remind them? He asked cautiously. The Don fixed him with a steady gaze. We need to make a statement. Something that will make them think twice before stepping into Rocinha again. Antonio didn't press for details, but he knew what the Don was implying. Many people still think that violence in this world is random, but Antonio understood it was often deliberate, calculated to send a message. So what do you think? If fear keeps your community safe, would you be willing to inflict it on others? The following week was tense. Antonio oversaw the usual tournaments and community projects, but he could sense the Don's men preparing for something larger. He saw more weapons moving through the favela, more late-night meetings, more unfamiliar faces with the hard eyes of enforcers. Then it happened. A police convoy was ambushed on the outskirts of Rocinha, leaving several officers injured and one dead. The attack made headlines across Brazil, and the authorities vowed swift retaliation. Marcelo defended the ambush. "They had it coming," he said. "They've been raiding us for months, arresting our people, terrorizing families. Now they know we won't be pushed around." Antonio didn't argue, but he couldn't ignore the unease building inside him. He knew the attack would only escalate the conflict, drawing even more attention to Rocinha. And he was right. The police presence intensified almost overnight. Armored vehicles patrolled the hills, helicopters hovered overhead for hours at a time, and plainclothes officers infiltrated the community in ways Antonio hadn't seen before. The Don responded by tightening security even further, limiting who could enter certain areas and stationing armed guards at key intersections. Amid the chaos, Mariana resurfaced. Antonio found her waiting near the edge of the favela one evening, her expression serious. "The police are saying they're planning a major operation," she told him. "They're going to move on Rocinha in the next few weeks. If you stay here, you could be caught in the middle." Antonio felt his chest tighten. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't want to see you go down with the Don," Mariana said softly. "You're better than this, Antonio. You don't have to stay." Antonio shook his head. "You don't understand. I can't just walk away." Mariana reached out, touching his arm gently. "Then at least think about what happens if you stay. This won't end the way you think it will." Antonio didn't reply. He slipped back into the shadows, her words following him like a ghost. That night, Marcelo found him pacing in their safe house. "You're jumpy," Marcelo said. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Antonio lied, though he felt the walls closing in. He knew Rocinha was headed toward another storm, and this time, he wasn't sure there would be a way to escape it. The warning Mariana had given Antonio refused to leave his mind. A major operation, weeks away. He could already picture the helicopters descending, the police sweeping through Rocinha like a tide. He'd lived through raids before, but something about her words carried a finality that frightened him. Marcelo noticed the tension gnawing at him. "You're wound too tight," he said one night as they shared a quiet moment on the rooftop overlooking the glowing city. "We've been through worse. The Don has a plan. We'll be fine." Antonio didn't answer. He thought of the ambushed convoy, of the Don's insistence on making a statement, and of Mariana's plea for him to walk away. He wanted to believe Marcelo, but the cracks in the Don's empire were widening. The Don convened a late-night meeting with his corps lieutenants, including Antonio. He stood at the center of a dimly lit room, maps of Rocinha spread across a table. "The police think they can break us," he said calmly. "They are wrong. We have survived worse storms than this. We know these hills better than they ever will." One lieutenant raised a concern. "The raids are getting closer. They're hitting safe houses they couldn't possibly know about without inside help. We have another informant." The Don's eyes hardened. "Then we find them. No one leaves Rocinha until we do." Antonio felt the room grow colder. He knew what finding the informant would mean. Many people still think that fear alone can hold a community together, but Antonio could see how fear was fraying Rocinha from the inside. "So, what do you think? Would you rather live under fear than face the chaos of losing control entirely?" In the days that followed, the Don's men tightened their grip on the favela. Checkpoints were set up at key entrances, and anyone entering or leaving was searched. Patrols roamed the alleys, their rifles glinting under the harsh streetlights. The once lively community felt suffocated. Antonio did his best to maintain the facade of normalcy. He continued organizing tournaments and delivering food to families, but the smiles he received felt strained. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly now kept their distance, wary of attracting unwanted attention. One night, after a long day of moving cash and product to hidden caches, Antonio found himself walking alone through a narrow alley. He thought he heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, the alley was empty. He quickened his pace, his hand brushing the folded newspaper still tucked in his jacket pocket. When he reached the safe house, Marcelo was waiting. "The Don wants us at the warehouse," he said grimly. Now, Antonio followed him through the silent streets, his stomach tight with dread. When they arrived, several of the Don's lieutenants were already there, standing in a circle around a bound man. "This is the informant," one of them said. "He's been feeding information to the police for months." Antonio's breath caught when he recognized the man, one of the couriers he had trained, a kid barely 18. He was trembling, his eyes darting from face to face. "Please," he begged. "I didn't tell them anything. They threatened my family. I had no choice." The Don stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We all have choices," he said quietly. "And you made yours." Antonio felt the air grow heavier as the Don gave a small nod. The execution was swift, a single shot echoing through the warehouse. Antonio turned his head, the memory of the lieutenant's death still fresh in his mind. Marcelo clapped him on the shoulder as they left. "This is how we survive, Nem. Don't forget that." Antonio nodded mutely, but his thoughts were racing. Mariana had been right. This wasn't going to end well. The police were tightening their net, and the Don's paranoia was consuming them from within. That night, Antonio stood on the rooftop of the safe house, staring out at Rio's glittering skyline. He thought about his mother, about the kids who idolized him, about the Don's warning that love could turn to suspicion in an instant. He knew he was running out of time to decide which side of Rocinha's story he wanted to be on. The air in Rocinha felt heavier than ever in the days following the warehouse execution. People walked the streets with their heads down. Conversations were hushed, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The Don's men were everywhere, patrolling the alleys with their rifles slung across their shoulders, their eyes scanning for signs of betrayal. Antonio could feel the community's trust eroding. Mothers still thanked him for the food drives, children still cheered at the soccer tournaments, but it all felt strained, like a play everyone was performing to keep from drawing suspicion. He knew the facade could only hold so long. Marcelo tried to keep things steady. "The Don's tightening up because he has to," he told Antonio one evening, as they stood at a checkpoint, watching a group of men search every car entering the favela. "The police are planning something big. If we're not ready, it's over." Antonio nodded, though he wasn't sure what ready even meant anymore. The Don's empire was a fortress, but it was also a cage. He could feel the walls closing in with every passing day. The raids were escalating. Federal forces were now involved, and their operations were far more coordinated than before. One night, a helicopter hovered low over the favela for hours, its searchlight cutting across the hillsides like a blade. Antonio and Marcelo crouched in a safe house, listening to the distant sound of boots and gunfire. "They're testing us," Marcelo said quietly. "They want to see how we react before the real hit." Antonio didn't respond. He was thinking about Mariana's warning, about how little time they might have left. The Don called another meeting the following day. His face was calm as ever, but his eyes burned with intensity. "The police think they can storm Rocinha and take me in," he said. "But they forget. I have eyes everywhere. We know their plans, and we will be ready." Antonio listened as the Don outlined defensive strategies: blockades, decoy stash houses, escape routes through the hills. It was a military operation in all but name. But what struck Antonio most was the Don's confidence. He truly believed he could outlast the authorities. After the meeting, Marcelo clapped Antonio on the back. "See? We've got this. As long as we stick together, they can't break us." Antonio forced a smile, but inside, doubt gnawed at him. Many people still think that sheer willpower can stop the inevitable, but Antonio could feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on Rocinha. "So what do you think? Can you ever truly win a battle when the enemy has endless resources and the world watching?" That night, Antonio made his way to the edge of the favela, where Mariana had met him before. He didn't expect her to be there, but she was, waiting in the shadows. "You came," she said softly. Antonio looked around nervously. "I shouldn't be here. If anyone sees us..." "No one saw me," Mariana assured him. "I just needed to warn you again. The operation is happening soon. Days, maybe a week. They're coming in full force, Antonio. You need to leave while you can." Antonio shook his head. "I can't. My family's here. Marcelo's here. If I disappear now, they'll think I betrayed them." Mariana stepped closer. "Then take your family and go. Please, you don't have to go down with the Don." Antonio stared at her, torn. He wanted to believe escape was possible, but he knew the Don's reach extended far beyond Rocinha, and leaving would mean abandoning the people who trusted him, the community he had spent years trying to protect. "I can't just walk away," he said finally. Mariana's eyes softened with sadness. "Then be careful, because when they come, it's going to be like nothing you've ever seen." She slipped away into the night, leaving Antonio alone with his thoughts. When he returned to the safe house, Marcelo was waiting. "Where were you?" he asked sharply. "Nowhere," Antonio lied. Marcelo stared at him for a long moment before sighing. "You've got that faraway look again. Don't lose focus, Nem. We need you more than ever right now." Antonio nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He knew Mariana was right. The police were coming, and when they did, Rocinha would become a battlefield. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. The atmosphere in Rocinha was suffocating now, thick with the sense that something unstoppable was on its way. Antonio could feel it in the way people whispered to each other in doorways, in the way the Don's men clutched their rifles tighter, in the way helicopters seemed to hover longer over the hills. Every sound felt amplified: the rumble of motorbikes, the snap of distant fireworks, the occasional crack of gunfire carried on the humid night air. Marcelo was doing his best to keep morale high, but even he was fraying at the edges. "We're not going anywhere," he said, as he and Antonio stood on a rooftop scanning the hills for movement. "The Don's got us fortified. When they come, we'll be ready." Antonio wanted to believe him, but he couldn't ignore the dread curling in his stomach. He had been around long enough to know that the police didn't pour resources into an operation unless they intended to see it through. And this time, the Don wasn't just facing local officers. This was federal. The Don's paranoia had reached new levels. He ordered round-the-clock surveillance on everyone, even those closest to him. Antonio noticed lieutenants watching each other with suspicion. Conversations cut short when someone walked into a room. Trust was a fragile commodity, and it was crumbling fast. One evening, the Don summoned Antonio privately. "You're important to me," he said, his voice calm but heavy. "The community trusts you. And that's why you must be more vigilant than ever. If you see any sign of weakness, any sign of betrayal, you come to me first. Do you understand?" Antonio nodded, though the weight of the request pressed on him like a stone. "I understand." The Don's eyes lingered on him. "I mean it, Antonio. We are surrounded by enemies, and sometimes they wear familiar faces." When Antonio left the meeting, Marcelo was waiting outside. "What did he say?" "He told me to watch for betrayal," Antonio said. Marcelo nodded grimly. "He's telling everyone that. We can't let this paranoia tear us apart," but it already was. Antonio could feel it in the way crew members avoided eye contact, in the way mothers pulled their children closer when armed men passed by. Many people still think that fear unites communities under a common goal, but Antonio knew it only bred isolation. So what do you think? Can you truly build loyalty when everyone is terrified of each other? A few days later, Antonio returned to his house briefly to see his mother. She hugged him tightly, her face lined with worry. "You're barely home anymore," she said softly. "I don't like what this is doing to you. You used to smile more." Antonio felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to tell her everything, that he was afraid, that he was trapped, that he didn't know how to save her if the police stormed Rocinha. But he simply kissed her on the forehead and said, "I'm fine, Mai. I just have a lot of responsibilities right now." As he left, he saw the kids playing soccer in the narrow alley, the ball bouncing off walls with hollow thuds. Their laughter was a reminder of why he had once believed in the work he was doing. But even that felt distant now. Later that night, Marcelo brought troubling news. "We've got people wavering," he said. "Some of the crew are talking about cutting deals with the police if things go south. If the Don finds out," Antonio didn't need him to finish the sentence. "Do you think any of them will actually do it?" Marcelo hesitated. "I don't know, but the Don won't take chances. He's already planning to move some of them out. Permanently." Antonio's stomach churned. He knew what permanently meant. "There has to be another way," he said. Marcelo shook his head. "This isn't soccer, Nem. There are no second chances. If the Don thinks you're a liability, you're gone." That night, Antonio couldn't sleep. He lay in a safe house listening to the city hum around him, wondering how much longer he could keep walking this line. Mariana's words haunted him. "You don't have to stay. You don't have to go down with the Don." But leaving wasn't as simple as walking away. He was too deep, too visible, and he knew the Don's network reached far beyond Rocinha. The following morning, Antonio looked out over the hills as the sun rose. He could see the police staging vehicles in the distance, their presence a constant threat. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Something had to give soon, and when it did, Antonio wasn't sure which way he would fall. The tension reached a fever pitch. Every breath in Rocinha felt shallow, stolen. The Don's men tightened their perimeter, locking down entry points and cutting escape routes to outsiders. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, afraid that even an innocent comment could be twisted into something dangerous. Antonio could see it in their eyes when he walked past. Hope and fear braided together like the tangled wires overhead. Marcelo tried to keep the machine running, but the paranoia was relentless. "I don't like how everyone's looking at each other," he muttered as he and Antonio moved cash from one stash house to another late one night. "It's like no one trusts anyone anymore." Antonio nodded. "Because they don't," he said softly. When they returned to the safe house, the Don was waiting. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud. He motioned for Antonio to sit. "I've been thinking," he said calmly. "The police are almost ready. We can feel it. They want to make me an example, but we won't give them the satisfaction. Antonio kept his voice even. What's the plan? The Don leaned forward, his hands clasped. We strike first. Not at them, but at the people who've betrayed us from within. If there's even a chance someone is talking to the police, we remove the threat. Antonio felt a chill. Are you sure? What if we're wrong? The Don's eyes hardened. We can't afford to be wrong. Loyalty is the only thing keeping us alive right now. Antonio didn't argue, but he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He knew the Don was right about loyalty, but he also knew how quickly suspicion could devour the innocent. Many people still think that power is lost in big, dramatic moments, but Antonio could see how it eroded silently, like water wearing away stone. So, what do you think? How far would you go to preserve your grip on something slipping away? The Don's orders were carried out swiftly. Several men and women who had been with the crew for years simply vanished. Antonio didn't ask questions, though the guilt of silence pressed heavily on him. Marcelo tried to reassure him. This is how the Don keeps us safe, he said. It's ugly, but it's necessary. But Antonio could see how fragile that safety really was. The police were still preparing for their final operation, and now the community was beginning to fracture. He heard rumors that some families were preparing to flee Rocinha entirely, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. One night, after delivering supplies to a family near the edge of the favela, Antonio found Mariana waiting in the shadows. She stepped forward quietly, her expression grim. "This is it," she whispered. "The operation is happening in the next 48 hours. They're coming in with everything. Federal forces, armored vehicles, helicopters. It's going to be a war." Antonio's pulse quickened. "Then I don't have time," he said. Mariana reached for his arm. "You can still leave, Antonio. Take your mother. Take whoever you can and get out before it's too late." He pulled away. "If I disappear now, the Don will know. He'll think I betrayed him. And if you stay, you'll be caught in the middle," Mariana said urgently. "Do you want your mother to watch you get dragged away in handcuffs? Or worse?" Antonio didn't answer. He wanted to leave, to escape the tightening noose, but he couldn't abandon Marcelo, his family, or the community that looked to him for leadership. "Please think about it," Mariana said. "You deserve a life outside of this place." She slipped away into the night before Antonio could respond. When he returned to the safe house, Marcelo was pacing. "The Don wants everyone ready," he said. "He thinks the police will hit us at dawn tomorrow or the day after. We're sealing the entrances and moving all the product deeper into the hills." Antonio nodded, though his mind was spinning. He went through the motions, helping to secure stash houses and coordinate lookouts, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. That night, he stood on the rooftop again, staring out at Rio's skyline glowing in the distance. He thought about Mariana's plea, about his mother asleep just a few blocks away, about the children who would wake up tomorrow not knowing if they'd survive the day. He knew he had to make a choice soon. Dawn approached like a predator. The stillness in Rocinha was unnatural, so heavy that even the morning birds seemed muted. Antonio felt it the moment he opened his eyes in the safe house. Marcelo already awake and pacing. "They're coming," Marcelo muttered, glancing out the window toward the hillside where the road snaked into the favela. "I can feel it. We'll hear the helicopters before we see them." Antonio forced himself to stay calm. "Do we have everyone in position?" Marcelo nodded grimly. "Entrances are blocked, lookouts on every rooftop. Stash houses moved deeper into the hills. The Don wants everyone ready to hold the line." Antonio didn't respond. He knew the Don's orders would buy time at best. The police had been building this operation for months, maybe years. They weren't coming to retreat. By mid-morning, the first sounds reached them. The distant thump of helicopter blades, the grind of armored vehicles on pavement. Marcelo grabbed Antonio's arm. "We have to get to the Don. Now!" They navigated Rocinha's narrow alleys, moving quickly but carefully. People were already barricading themselves inside their homes, pulling children close, shuttering windows. Antonio caught glimpses of fear-stricken faces peering through cracks in doors. When they reached the Don's compound, the atmosphere was electric. Armed men scurried between rooms, radios crackling with updates from lookouts. The Don stood in the center, calm amid the chaos. "They're at the perimeter," he said quietly. "We hold them as long as we can. The hills are ours. They can't navigate them like we do. And if it becomes impossible..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Antonio understood. Escape into the labyrinthine terrain. Antonio swallowed hard. "Do you really think we can get out?" The Don's eyes locked on his. "I think we do what we must. Survival is the only rule now." Minutes later, the raid began in earnest. Helicopters swooped low, their searchlights slicing through the early haze. Armored vehicles forced their way into Rocinha's main roads, and waves of heavily armed officers fanned out, shouting commands through bullhorns. The Don's men fired back sporadically, more to slow the advance than to engage fully. Antonio and Marcelo crouched behind a reinforced wall, the ground trembling with each blast of gunfire and flashbangs. "This isn't going to hold," Marcelo shouted over the noise. "I know," Antonio replied, scanning for an escape route. The Don moved with precision, directing his men toward fallback positions deeper into the favela. "We use the tunnels," he ordered. "Only those who know the hills can follow us there." Antonio followed Marcelo and the others as they ducked into a hidden passage beneath a collapsed building. The tunnel was narrow, the air thick with dust, but it led them away from the immediate fighting. As they emerged onto a higher ridge overlooking Rocinha, Antonio looked back. From their vantage point, he could see the full scale of the operation. The police were everywhere, swarming through the alleys, searching homes, seizing stash houses. Helicopters hovered like vultures, their searchlights illuminating the chaos below. Marcelo caught Antonio's gaze. "We're not going back," he said. "Not today." Antonio nodded, though the weight of what they were leaving behind was crushing. He thought about his mother, who was still somewhere in Rocinha, and about the community that would bear the brunt of the Don's downfall. Many people still think that leaders can protect their people in times like these, but Antonio knew the truth. The community would be left to fend for itself. The group continued moving through the hills, the Don at the front. He was silent, his jaw tight, but his focus was clear. Evade, capture at all costs. As night fell, they reached a remote safe house deep in the forested hills beyond Rocinha. The Don gathered everyone inside. "We'll regroup here," he said, "but we need to be ready to move again. The police won't stop until they have me in chains." Antonio sat on the floor, his body exhausted, his mind racing. He knew Mariana had been right. The raid was unlike anything he had ever seen, and it was far from over. The safe house in the hills was eerily quiet compared to the chaos they'd left behind in Rocinha. Antonio sat near the single flickering lantern, his knees drawn up, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. He could hear Marcelo pacing outside, talking in hushed tones with the Don's lieutenants, planning their next move. The Don entered the room, his expression as unreadable as ever. "We can't stay here long," he said. They'll search every inch of these hills until they find us. We need to keep moving. Tonight, Antonio finally spoke. What about Rocinha? The people, my family. The Don's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. They'll survive, he said quietly. They always do. But we can't help them if we're in chains, or worse. Antonio looked away. He could still picture his mother's worried face, the children kicking soccer balls through the narrow alleys, the neighbors who had thanked him for food and clean water. He realized that the Don's empire had always been built on a fragile illusion, that the community was protected because of the Don, when in reality, it was the community that had protected him. As night fell, the group prepared to leave the safe house. Marcelo handed Antonio a small bag with cash and supplies. Keep this on you, he said. We don't know where we'll end up next. They moved silently through the dense underbrush, guided by men who knew the hills like the backs of their hands. Antonio followed close behind Marcelo, every crack of a twig making his heart pound. He thought about Mariana's warning, about how he could have left before the raid. But it was too late now. Suddenly, the sound of helicopters roared overhead. Spotlights cut through the trees, sweeping across the hillsides. Down, the Don hissed, and the group scattered for cover. Antonio pressed himself flat against the damp earth as the searchlights passed, illuminating the fear etched into the faces of those around him. When the helicopters finally moved on, the Don motioned for them to continue. They hiked for hours, their bodies pushed to the brink, until they reached another hidden safe house farther from the city. Inside, the Don gathered everyone around. We're going to regroup, he said firmly. We'll rebuild. This isn't the end. But Antonio wasn't so sure. He could see the exhaustion in Marcelo's eyes, the cracks in the Don's confidence. The empire they had built was crumbling, and no amount of defiance could change that. That night, Antonio lay awake on the cold floor, staring at the wooden beams overhead. He thought about the boy who had once spent his afternoons kicking a soccer ball through Rocinha's alleys, dreaming of a life beyond the favela. He thought about the choices that had led him here, and the lives that had been lost along the way. Many people still think that men like Antonio choose this life freely, but he knew it was never that simple. It was survival, shaped by circumstance, by the lack of choices available in a world that seemed designed to forget places like Rocinha. So what do you think? If you were born into a world where survival meant compromise, how would you have chosen? The group would move again soon, Antonio knew. But for the moment, there was a strange stillness in the safe house. He closed his eyes and let his thoughts drift, unsure of what the future held. He only knew that Rocinha would go on without him, and that whatever came next, he would carry the weight of its story forever. And now, as we leave Antonio and Rocinha in the shadowed hills, let's slow the pace together. Imagine the quiet after the storm has passed. The air still heavy but a little cleaner. The first hints of dawn painting soft colors along the horizon. The sounds of helicopters and gunfire fade, replaced by the gentle rustle of wind through the trees, the distant hum of a city waking up far below. Take a moment to picture Rocinha's hills bathed in early light, the maze of rooftops glowing softly, children emerging cautiously from their homes to kick a worn soccer ball on a familiar dusty pitch. Life continues, even after so much has changed. Breathe deeply, allowing yourself to settle into that image. Every inhale carries away the tension of Antonio's journey, every exhale releasing the heaviness of the choices he faced. In the end, this was a story about survival and community, about how people can endure even when the world seems determined to press down on them. As you drift further into stillness, think of Antonio finding a quiet spot in the hills, resting for a moment before moving forward again. Picture him taking in the horizon, the sound of wind in the trees, a reminder that life, in its simplest form, goes on. Your breath slows now, soft and steady, as the story fades into a gentle hum. You're safe here, far from the noise and fear of Rocinha's nights. Allow your body to grow heavier with each passing second, your thoughts softening like the hills disappearing into morning mist. Sleep well and dream gently.